Most people imagine Moses' exclusion from the Promised Land as a harsh divine punishment for a minor slip of the tongue. The truth is far more layered. What really happened at the waters of Meribah required decades of accumulated weight, a shattered public trust, and a single act of defiance that no leader in his position could ever recover from. This is the story you were never told about the man who led an entire nation for 40 years and died within eyeshot of a border he would never cross. For 4 decades, you would have watched a man carry a burden that would have crushed any other human being. Around 600,000 men able to bear arms, meaning a total population, when you add women, children, and the elderly, of somewhere between 2 million and 2.5 million souls, moved through the wilderness of Sinai under the direction of a single leader. The livestock alone, according to the estimates historians extract from the biblical inventories, would have numbered in the hundreds of thousands. Every complaint, every rebellion, every sickness, every death, every request for water, every demand for meat, every dispute between neighbors, every moral crisis flowed upward through one channel: Moses. 2 elements defined that entire journey, and both would eventually converge at the same moment. The first was water. From the very first weeks after crossing the Red Sea, water became the recurring emergency, the pressure point that revealed the true temperature of the camp. The second was Moses' staff, a wooden rod that had already turned into a serpent before Pharaoh, already parted a sea, already brought forth water once from solid rock. That staff became over the years something more than a tool. It became a symbol the people recognized instantly, a visible extension of the authority Moses carried. Remember both of these elements. They will meet again in a way no one in the camp anticipated. The wilderness had a rhythm, and it was brutal. Days that pushed temperatures above 110 degrees Fahrenheit alternated with nights that dropped near freezing. You would have walked across ground that offered almost nothing. Jagged limestone, sand that shifted under sandals, worn thin by hundreds of miles, stretches of gravel that cut through cheap leather within weeks. The daily ration of manna, the strange bread-like substance that appeared with the morning dew, kept the population alive but never quite satisfied. For 40 years, nearly the same food. For 40 years, the same sky, the same tents, the same faces growing older together. Water rations, by the estimates of the historians who have modeled the logistics, would have required something approaching 750,000 gallons per day for humans and animals combined. Every camp move meant scouting for wells. Every dry stretch meant a crisis waiting to happen. And through all of it, Moses. 80 years old when he first stood before Pharaoh. 120 by the time he climbed the mountain to die. 40 of those years spent absorbing the emotional weight of a population that, according to the accounts, complained roughly 10 distinct times in ways severe enough to be recorded. 10 recorded rebellions. 10 moments when the entire enterprise almost collapsed, and every single time, Moses was the one who stood between the anger of the people and the fire of divine judgment. You would think that a man like that would be granted the reward. You would think that after 4 decades of intercession, after the golden calf, after Korah's revolt, after the report of the 12 spies, after the plague that killed 14,700 people in a single day, Moses would have earned the right to cross the Jordan and rest under the shade of the land promised to Abraham 6 centuries earlier. He did not. The reason lies in a specific place, on a specific day, in the 40th year of the journey. And to understand it, you have to understand what came just before it. Miriam died, Moses' older sister, the same woman who as a young girl had watched over him when their mother placed him in a basket among the reeds of the Nile, died at Kadesh in the first month of that 40th year. The biblical account gives her death only one verse, Numbers chapter 20, verse 1, a single sentence. But that single sentence carries an emotional weight that shapes everything that follows. Miriam had been more than a sister. She had been a prophetess in her own right, a leader among the women of Israel, a partner in the leadership triad that included her, Aaron, and Moses. Her death removed one of the three pillars that had held the movement upright since the Exodus. She had led the women in song after the crossing of the sea, tambourine in hand, at the very moment the waters closed over the Egyptian chariots. She had walked beside her brothers through every crisis that followed, and she was buried there in the wilderness in a shallow grave under a pile of stones, because that was all the wandering nation could offer. Moses buried his sister, and on that same trip, in that same location, the people began to complain about water. The timing was cruel. The community had arrived at Kadesh expecting to find sufficient wells. They found nothing. The animals were bellowing. Children were crying. The elderly were beginning to show the early signs of dehydration, cracked lips, sunken eyes, the confused wandering that precedes collapse. And within days of burying his sister, Moses found himself surrounded once more by an angry crowd demanding that he solve a problem he could not, by himself, solve. The complaint that day was particularly bitter. The people accused Moses of dragging them into the wilderness to die. They mocked the memory of Egypt, calling it a land of figs and vines and pomegranates, conveniently forgetting the whips and the mud pits and the murdered infants. They accused him of leading them to a place without grain, without water, without hope. And they did it loudly enough that the noise of their rebellion reached the door of the tent of meeting. Moses and Aaron did what they had always done. They walked away from the shouting, went to the entrance of the tabernacle, and fell on their faces before the presence of the Lord. And the glory of the Lord appeared. And a specific instruction was given. The instruction is critical to understanding what followed. God told Moses to take the staff, to gather the assembly, and to speak to the rock in front of everyone. Speak, not strike. Speak. The rock would then release its water. The message was clear, and it was different from the miracle performed nearly 40 years earlier at a place called Rephidim, where Moses had been commanded to strike a rock with the same staff. That earlier miracle had involved impact. This one was to involve only the voice. The distinction was not accidental. Moses gathered the people. He stood in front of the rock, and then something snapped inside him. He raised the staff. He looked at the crowd, and he said the words that sealed his fate. "Listen now, you rebels. Must we bring you water out of this rock?" And then he struck the rock. Not once, twice. The water came, abundantly, enough for the entire nation and every animal in the camp. The miracle happened exactly as the people needed it to happen. But for Moses, the moment was already lost. To understand why the punishment was so severe, you have to slow down and examine what actually took place in those few seconds. There were, according to the analysis of scholars who have studied this passage for centuries, at least 4 distinct failures compressed into one action. First, there was the language. Must we bring you water? The pronoun was catastrophic. Moses attributed the miracle to himself and to Aaron, as if the water were something they were capable of producing, in front of an entire nation, at a moment when the singular purpose of the miracle was to demonstrate once again that the source of provision was not the leader, but the Lord. Second, there was the tone. The insult, "you rebels," was born of 40 years of accumulated frustration. It was human. It was understandable, but it was also a leader publicly venting private exhaustion at a people who, in that specific moment, were being addressed by God through a miracle of mercy. The tone shifted the narrative from divine grace to human contempt. Third, there was the act itself, the strike. God had said, "Speak." Moses struck, and he struck twice. The doubling of the blow was not a technicality. It was defiance visible to every pair of eyes in the crowd. The people were watching. They saw the raised staff. They heard the first crack of wood against stone. They heard the second, and they understood, without being told, that the leader had chosen his own method over the divine instruction. Fourth, and most devastating of all, there was the misrepresentation. Moses' action turned the rock incident into a display of angry authority rather than a display of patient grace. The people were meant to walk away from that moment understanding something new about the character of the God who was providing for them. Instead, they walked away with a distorted picture filtered through the frustration of a man at the end of his rope. And that is why the sentence was pronounced. Numbers chapter 20, verse 12. God spoke to Moses and Aaron and said that because they had not trusted him enough to honor him as holy in the sight of the Israelites, they would not bring the assembly into the land he was giving them. 2 men, 1 sentence, both banned from the destination. The words landed with a weight that no one in the camp could yet feel. The people had their water. The immediate crisis had passed. Life in the wilderness went on. But for Moses, the horizon had shifted forever. Every step from that day forward would be a step toward a boundary he was not permitted to cross. Understand something about what this meant. Moses had been sustained by one hope for 4 decades. The land promised to Abraham, the land where his ancestors had walked, the land flowing with milk and honey. Every negotiation with Pharaoh, every night spent listening to complaints, every intercession that pulled his people back from the edge of divine wrath, all of it had been fuel for that single vision. And now, at the age of 120, in the final months of the journey, he was told that the vision would remain a vision. He asked once for the sentence to be lifted. Deuteronomy chapter 3 preserves the moment. Moses pleaded. He begged in the direct language of a man who has served long and asked for little. He asked to be allowed to cross over, to see the good land beyond the Jordan, the fine hill country, and Lebanon. And the answer was final. God told him not to speak of the matter again. There was no negotiation. There was no partial reprieve. The decision had been rendered. To grasp the fairness of the sentence, you have to understand something the surface of the story hides. The leadership of Moses was not judged by the standard of the people he led. It was judged by the standard of the calling he carried. He had spoken with God face to face, as the text puts it, as a man speaks with his friend. He had received the law at Sinai across a period of 40 days and 40 nights on the mountain, twice. He had entered the cloud on the mountain and returned with his face shining so brightly that he had to cover it with a veil to speak with the people. No prophet before or after had that access, that intimacy, that responsibility. And with that responsibility came a corresponding weight of accountability. There is a pattern in the biblical accounts that becomes visible only when you step back and look at the full length of Moses' ministry. The moments of failure were rare, but they were consistent in one respect. Each of them involved the misuse of the staff, the misuse of the voice, or the confusion of divine authority with personal authority. At Rephidim, the strike had been commanded. At Meribah, the speech had been commanded. The tools were the same. The instructions were different. And what was tested in both cases was not the miracle itself, but the obedience of the intermediary. Aaron shared the sentence, and Aaron was the first to go. On the road to Edom, at a mountain called Hor, Moses and Aaron's son Eleazar climbed together to the summit. It was a private moment. No crowd, no ceremony. Just 3 men walking up a bare slope with the sun overhead and the future waiting below. At the top, Moses removed the priestly garments from Aaron and placed them on Eleazar. The transfer of the high priesthood happened there, in the open air, without fanfare. And Aaron died on that mountain. He was 123 years old. The nation below wept for 30 days. Moses walked back down alone with Eleazar. Think about what that walk must have been. Aaron had been the older brother. Aaron had been the mouthpiece before Pharaoh in the early days, the voice that spoke while Moses stood silent. Aaron had shared the burden of every complaint, every rebellion, every judgment. And now Aaron was buried on a foreign mountain, and Moses had personally participated in his brother's transition from life to death. And the same fate, a mountain, a summit, a burial away from the people, was waiting for him. But Moses did not stop. This is the detail that reveals the character of the man. He did not sulk. He did not withdraw. He did not spend his final months rehearsing the injustice. He kept working. He led the nation through the final campaigns east of the Jordan. He defeated the armies of Sihon and Og, two kings whose combined territories stretched across hundreds of miles of contested ground. He divided the conquered territories among the tribes of Reuben and Gad and half the tribe of Manasseh. He appointed Joshua as his successor with a public transfer of authority so complete that no one in the camp could question the continuity. And then he sat down and wrote. The entire book of Deuteronomy, 34 chapters, more than 950 verses in the Hebrew text, is Moses' final address to the people he would not accompany into the land. It is a summary of the law, a rehearsal of the journey, a prophetic warning about the future, a series of blessings and curses, and a farewell song of extraordinary poetic power. He wrote it, or delivered it orally to those who wrote it, in the final weeks of his life. He wrote, knowing he would not cross. He wrote knowing that every promise contained in the text was a promise he would never see fulfilled from the inside. The scale of that discipline is worth measuring. A man of 120 denied the reward of his life's work, spent his final energy preparing the next generation to inherit what he had been forbidden to enter. There is no bitterness in the text. There is no complaint. There is only the careful, patient labor of a leader determined that his exclusion would not become the nation's excuse. And then came the day. Deuteronomy chapter 34 opens with the Ascent. Moses climbed alone. He climbed from the plains of Moab up to the top of Pisgah on Mount Nebo, opposite Jericho. The climb itself would have been demanding for a man of his age, even one whose eyes were undimmed and whose strength was unabated, as the text specifically records. The elevation of the summit reaches roughly 2,700 feet above the plains. From that height, on a clear day, the view opens westward across the Jordan Valley toward the hill country of Judah and beyond to the coastal plain. On the clearest mornings, when the haze lifts off the Dead Sea, you can see the towers of what would one day be Jerusalem faintly outlined against the western sky. At the summit, God showed him the land. The account is precise. Gilead as far as Dan to the north, all of Naphtali, the territory of Ephraim and Manasseh, all the land of Judah as far as the western sea, the Negev to the south, the valley of the plain of Jericho, the city of palms as far as Zoar. Every future tribal territory, every future city, every future battlefield, every future kingdom, shown to him in one panoramic sweep from the summit of a mountain he would never leave. And then God spoke to him one last time. This is the land I promised on oath to Abraham, to Isaac and to Jacob when I said, I will give it to your descendants. I have let you see it with your eyes, but you will not cross over into it. The words that had been pronounced years earlier at Meribah were fulfilled at the summit of Nebo, not as punishment layered on punishment, but as the closing of a circle that had begun with a raised staff and a struck rock. Silence. Moses stood on that summit and looked at the land, alone. No crowd, no successor at his side, no family to hold his hand. Just the man and the mountain and the horizon and the God who had walked with him for 40 years. And there, on that mountain, Moses died. The text records his age, 120 years old. It records the state of his body. His eyes were not weak, and his strength was not gone. His death was not the natural collapse of a wasted frame. It was, in every physical sense, the death of a man still capable of leading, still capable of walking, still capable of climbing another mountain if one had been placed before him. He died because his time had ended, not because his body had failed. And then the strangest detail of the entire account. He buried him in a valley in the land of Moab, opposite Beth Peor, but no one knows to this day where his grave is. No one knows. The grave of the greatest prophet of the Old Testament, the man who received the law, the man who parted the sea, the man who spoke with God face to face, was hidden, deliberately, concealed by the same hand that had led him. And the reason historians and theologians have suggested for centuries was almost certainly to prevent the burial site from becoming a shrine, a place of pilgrimage, a location where the memory of the man would be mistaken for the presence of the divine. Moses had spent 4 decades trying to keep the people focused on God rather than on the leader. In death, that same focus was preserved by the simplest possible means, the absence of any marker to worship. The nation below wept for 30 days. The mourning matched the mourning that had followed Aaron's death, and then they moved on. Joshua took command. The Jordan was crossed. The land was entered. The promises began to be fulfilled in stages over generations, through blood and struggle and moments of triumph that Moses himself had foreseen but would not witness from the inside. You have to sit with the weight of that ending. A man who invested his entire adult life in a destination he was not permitted to reach. A man who died within sight of the goal, alone on a mountain, buried by unseen hands in an unmarked grave. A man whose only recorded failure of that final stretch was to strike a rock twice when he had been told to speak to it once. And yet the story does not end at Nebo. Roughly 1,500 years after Moses died on that mountain, another mountain appears in the biblical account. A different summit, a different revelation. According to the gospel accounts, Jesus climbed a high mountain with 3 of his disciples and was transfigured before them. His face shone, his clothes became white as light, and 2 figures appeared beside him, speaking with him about his coming departure in Jerusalem. One of those figures was Elijah, the other was Moses. Moses, at last, stood in the promised land, not by crossing the Jordan on foot at the head of an army, not by treading the soil as a conqueror, but by appearing in glory on a mountain in Galilee, in conversation with the one whose ministry the entire law of Moses had been pointing toward from the beginning. The land he had been denied at 120 was granted to him, in a way he could not have imagined at the summit of Nebo. In the fullness of a moment he had helped make possible without knowing it. The exclusion at Meribah was final in one sense and temporary in another. It denied Moses the earthly reward. It preserved something more important, the lesson of representation, the lesson that no leader, however great, however experienced, however trusted, is above the requirement to honor the source of the message accurately in the sight of the people he leads. There is a mirror in this story that every generation has held up to itself. The people you lead are watching. The words you speak in a moment of exhaustion carry the weight of every year of authority you have accumulated. The public act, done in anger, cannot be undone by private repentance. The consequences of misrepresentation fall on the messenger, not on the message. And sometimes the reward of long faithfulness is not to enter the destination, but to prepare the next generation to enter it in your place. Moses did not fail. Moses succeeded at the task he was actually given, which was to lead a broken people out of slavery, to hand them a law that would define civilizations, and to bring them to the edge of the land they would inherit. What he was denied was the crossing. What he was granted was the vision from the summit, the naming of Joshua, the writing of Deuteronomy, and 15 centuries later, a place on a different mountain in a different conversation with a greater leader. The rock at Meribah still stands somewhere in the wilderness. The water it released has long since evaporated. The staff has been dust for millennia. The mountain of Nebo remains, still overlooking the Jordan Valley, still offering the same panoramic view Moses saw on his final day. Travelers climb it now. They stand where he stood. They look west across the same land he was shown before he closed his eyes. And they leave without ever knowing which valley below holds the unmarked grave of the man who brought them there.